So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay, and this is a rather atmospheric sunset, isn't it? Now, to be fair, you don't often see the sunset or sunrise weather types, which I think is a little bit of a shame, because I think they are probably one of the better looking weather types that Medieval 2 has to offer. We can't really do nighttime as such in recordings as this, because it's so hard to see anything that it's very difficult to make the settings actually work properly. But as you may have guessed from the title, this is something a little bit different in the sense that this is a reenactment of a historical event from Middle-earth, and this was given to me by Lord of Belagos, and I believe the idea is to do a few more of these. I have two at this current moment in time, but I believe the intent is to create and run a few more, like I just said. And we're starting off with a well-known event here, the disaster of GLADDEN Fields, where Isildur, on the way back from Mount Doom, lost the ring almost as quickly as he gained it, and his retinue was slaughtered to a man other than his youngest son, who managed to walk away from this disaster, as the battle name implies. And the elves of Mirkwood and the woodsmen who came to rush to their aid did manage to slaughter the orc party that was ambushing them, but it was too late, of course, to save Isildur and the lion's share of his unit. So, we will be going through the armies here. It is a relatively quick battle, as an ambush battle is going to be. I mean, especially seeing as there are 5 players on the field today. 2 armies of orcs. We'll see if it works out in exactly the same way here. It's mostly going to be a case of whether Isildur can hold out long enough for the elves of Mirkwood and the woodsmen to arrive, but it is going to be quite difficult, seeing as he does have to march willingly into the jaws of this orcish and goblin ambush that awaits him. So it's going to be an interesting experience for them, and there isn't really attackers and defenders as such, but we'll go through the ambushers first of all, seeing as they are the ones being more aggressive perhaps in this particular situation, starting off with Tintin 2208 playing as one of the ambush parties. Got some heavy goblin infantry here, which very basic in nature. Many of the Arthedain infantry will be quite happy to only have to face off against units such as this, although I'm sure that the Misty Mountains will have more at their disposal. Very recently we've seen the Misty Mountains be very effective after all, utilising their numbers to great effect, and in terms of ambushing they can bring to bear many of the same qualities that we saw in that situation as well. We shall see if they are able to do so efficiently enough to slay Isildur just like they did in the historical version of events. Goblin archers, very basic in nature as well. Arthedain have access to archers in their roster that will be able to deal with them, but based on the layout of this battle, I'm not entirely certain that they will be able to do so. Having said that, the goblin archers themselves are not going to be able to deal terribly high amounts of damage to higher level Arthedainian troops. We shall see. Few units of them. Misty Mountains do have a few units that can hide as well, so I don't know necessarily how much of Tintin's army is going to come skulking out of the tree cover as well, which of course can hide units that cannot hide anywhere as well. Black Uruks of the Mountains, they are going to be a unit which can trade blows with Arthedain a little bit more effectively than many of their mountain-based brethren, as we saw very recently as well in the Misty Mountains' defence of some of their home strongholds. But yeah, they should do pretty well against many of the, especially the basic Arthedain infantry units, they should do well against. And even against the stronger ones, they will at least do a better job at defending themselves. Another unit that will be able to trade relatively well with many of the more basic units Arthedain have to offer is going to be the Mountain Uruk host. They too will do pretty well against some of the missiles that Mirkwood will bring to bear later on, although another facet of this battle, I think the Misty Mountains will likely struggle to beat off the woodsmen and the Mirkwood advances, but we'll see. Mountain Uruk hosts do give them a solid front line to commit as and when they are needed, and then the Goblin King's bodyguard going to be Tintin's general. Very dependable unit of sword and shield bodyguard units this, as we have seen several times in the past, both in tournament settings and in real battle situations. Now then, moving on to the second ambushing army, we have Sanket playing once again in one of these. We've got some more Black Uruks of the Mountains, going to be one of the mainstays, I think, of this ambush party. They do have a decent charge bonus. It's one thing which many shock infantry units actually I don't mention all that often. The clue is in the name. Like, they are capable of delivering some pretty nasty quick shocks with their charges. Not so much as cavalry, just as a matter of course. And anyone who's played Medieval 2 will know this to be true. But the initial charge will be more useful in ambush situations like this than we see it many times in other kinds of battles, where it is their sustained melee damage which does set them apart. But on this occasion, we may see them get to lay down a good amount of effectiveness there. Based on the fact that much of his army is hidden in the trees, I don't know how much of it we're actually going to be able to go through. another unit of Goblin King's Bodyguard waiting in the wings, and several units of standard Goblin infantry here, even weaker than the heavy goblins in Tintin's army, but they are ready to charge forth when the Arthedainians march into their grip. But other than that, we're not going to be seeing anything else, but this is obviously not the entirety of his army. Indeed, the Goblin archers are already firing at them, so the ambush is technically already underway, but Arthedain getting up into defensive formation relatively quickly, forming up an infantry square. But this is, I think, the entirety of the Arthedain force under the command of Buzzard here, who's going to be trying to nurse Isildur through this battle. The Numenor Gate Guards, to give them their credit, will make for a very effective front line. Whether they can do so against the sheer weight of numbers that the orcs and goblins will be crashing down upon them with remains to be seen. Excuse me. Dunland Troll Slayers represent a very high damage unit as well. If they can go after the right kinds of units, thin out maybe the Black Uruks a little bit. If possible, going after something like the Goblin King's Bodyguard, then they could be extremely useful for keeping Isildur alive here, especially given the added armour piercing they have in melee, make them a very scary opponent for really all of the Misty Mountains forces that are arrayed against them here. Wardens of the North, looks like 2 units of them actually, which is a very potent weapon indeed for them to have at their disposal. Armour piercing missiles will be the sort of thing which can do damage even to the stronger units the Misty Mountains have to offer, namely the Goblin King's Bodyguard. I don't know if any blackbacks will reveal themselves as well, but that would be the prime target here for Arthedain to try and stop that damage raining down upon them. So Fornoster Rhine defenders, either side, they obviously have a very similar, well, exactly the same look as the upgraded Evendim Spearmen, because they are a unit which technically aren't really in the game as such anymore, though they can still be made for custom crafted scenarios such as this. And the differences, I think, are relatively minor. I think the Fornoster Rhine defenders are marginally better, but in terms of damage dealing capabilities, very, very similar. They will at least be able to hold the line maybe a little bit longer, I believe. Dismounted Fornoster Rhine Knights, exactly the kind of unit which will be very, very effective against the numerous goblins that come crashing against the line. Whether there's enough of them to stave off the relentless assault before reinforcements can arrive, again, that's the sort of thing which we'll have to wait and see. More defenders, more gate guards, and then just in behind we've got some Dunland Mounted Company and some Royal Court of House Armlaith making up the mounted divisions that Arthedain can utilise here, which may be able to buy them enough time and do enough damage to allow those reinforcements to arrive on time. Speaking of which, as we make our way over, Lord of Balagost himself is playing as the Woodsmen, which are being represented by Dunland, so Dunland for once get to act on behalf of the good guys, I suppose, although technically speaking it's not actually Misty Mountains and the Dunland that are fighting on this battlefield. They are just representations of what actually happened here. Dunlanding clansmen, of course, are not the strongest kind of units, but considering it is the Misty Mountains, I mean, they can trade tit for tat, really, with their lower end units, Dunland and the Misty Mountains. Dunland may very well be the only faction in the game that are more numbers heavy than the Misty Mountains, more because they're forced into being so with their limited options at the high end. But yeah, that's by the by, really. Dunland are a weird kind of faction based on where they sit. The Blackwolds, Berserkers, armour piercing, exactly the sort of thing which can do a lot of damage to the stronger Misty Mountains units once again. Berserkers, though, really do suffer when their hit points are expended. They tend to die off very quickly in those situations. Dunlanding veterans may actually find their niche here. The added damage that they do for a lower end line infantry unit with those hand axes that they have will actually find themselves being quite useful, I think, especially against the more basic goblins that are going to be attacking the Arthedain position. We shall have to wait and see whether when they arrive they're merely a clean-up crew or whether they are actually having to fight tooth and nail to bring the rest of the Misty Mountains forces down. Dunman Hunters are not too dissimilar to the Goblin Archers we've already seen, maybe a little bit better, but not by much, it must be said, which tells you all you really need to know about the quality of these units. And then there's a few other units as well, not a huge army this. Dunlanding Berserkers are a lesser seen unit in the game as it stands. I mean, Isengard, all of the other shock infantry units really are better choices, and for Dunland, I don't actually think they're a part of the main Dunland roster, weirdly enough. I think for a custom scenario you can select them, but in the regular Dunland force I'm not convinced they are. Either way, basic units of shock infantry, we know the drill. Stuff like Orc Maulers are a good comparison here. Dunlanders as a general rule do have a better anti-cav bonus, but I don't believe the Misty Mountains are going to be bringing wargs to the table unless they are hidden in the tree line. Blackwolds, more Dunlanding clansmen, more veterans, and another unit of Dunman Hunters as well. So there we have it, the entirety of the Dunland force, which is not huge, but as I mentioned, by the time Mirkwood and Dunland arrive, I do believe the Misty Mountains won't be able to withstand them. It's just a case of whether they can rescue Isildur or not. And Y2K86 is going to be playing as Mirkwood, who surely will have the lion's share of quality on the field today, especially with units like the Elders of the Elven King. I mean, we've seen Wardens of the North, which, in terms of armour-piercing arrows, probably more useful than the Silverthorns in all honesty, but the Elders offer that increased Elven defence in melee, which really does help them stay alive in tough situations. Several units of Blades of Emondwyr, they don't necessarily pack on a huge amount of armour, but in terms of their effectiveness in melee, again, that Elven melee defence helps them stand up there, and they're capable of dealing damage as well, some good damage values for a line infantry unit like this, which will be very good against the lighter goblins that they perceive. More Blades of Emondwyr, Hiripeng, which are going to be useful in melee as well as being really dominant at range in this kind of situation. Arthedain, usually an archer-centric faction as well, but given the disadvantageous situation they're in, facing down a goblin charge with support from archers in behind, they're not going to be able to utilise their Wardens of the North maybe as eagerly as they would like. The Hiripeng, however, when they arrive, will be able to set themselves up as they wish. Blades of Emondwyr, another unit of Hiripeng, and also some units that are hidden. Wooden Realm Patrol, another basic unit of archers, so plenty of ranged units that Mirkwood are going to be able to utilise here. And some Bows of Emondwyr as well. So when the reinforcements are allowed to move forward, the Bows of Emondwyr will be able to cover ground very quickly and start laying down some punishment on to the Misty Mountains ranks. But when that will be, we will only notice when the reinforcing armies start to move, but before then, we are going to be getting down to the business of the ambush itself and whether Isildur can face the onslaught and try and change his fate as we saw it in the actual stories themselves. So without further ado, let's get this historical battle underway. The numbers equation is most certainly going to be the most difficult aspect of this battle, I'm sure, for Isildur to try and survive through as the Goblin archers start to open up, and more of Sanket's army is also revealing itself as heavy Goblin spears start to march their way towards the initial enemy lines in behind the Goblin infantry. Now, one thing that I suppose they do have in their favour here is the fact that while it is still an ambush, they are not coming at them from all directions, so the initial box formation will be able to form itself into more traditional lines. One thing that I'm sure we're going to have to do as this battle goes along is to make liberal use of half speed, as we're going to do right now, purely because this is going to be quite a fast and frenetic battle, I'm sure, as the Goblin infantry starts to march their way in. Again, Dunland mounted company. As far as a cavalry unit goes, sword cavalry does lack a little bit in the charge, especially these single HP cavalry units in Reforged as it stands, but the Goblin infantry are very, very fragile, so they're still going to take a good amount of damage off the charge. So standard Goblin infantry also revealing itself for Tintin's army. Now, the Royal Court of House Armlaith represent a far bigger threat with their lances and their heavier nature in general on horseback, but you can see here this terrain may look fairly disadvantageous, I suppose, for Arthedain, but that may not prove to be the case actually, with Dunland Trollslayers and Wardens of the North actually getting involved in melee fairly quickly, and this may be out of necessity just to hold back the Goblins. They may wish to use more of their missiles, but they may not have the capability of actually utilising that many of them right from the off. But they do have some, and this is where I think this position will actually come into Arthedain's favour, because while they may be fighting uphill in melee, this does also expose the entirety of the Orcish and Goblin lines to missile fire. Ever closer draws the army from the side, however. This one unit of Dunland mounted company is thus far the only unit which is making the advance of Tintin's forces a little bit more awkward, but one unit of cavalry is not going to be enough to truly prevent the tide from crashing upon Isildur's current position. And you can see here that the trying to go for perhaps more of a concentration of force here. Maybe, trying to surround a position is tempting when it's like this, but the individual quality of the Arthedain units does mean that may prove to be more trouble than it's worth, especially if this line here is thin enough, which it is proving to be so, where the forces of evil are starting to force them back a little bit. Having said that, the Illuminous Gate Guards should be enough to deal with some of the more basic units. When heavy Goblin spears and their armour piercing start to get a little bit further forward, and the lines start to buckle a little bit more, that might change, but some dismounted Fornoster Rhine Knights also moving in to support the front lines. A lot of arrow fire coming in. The accuracy of basic goblin archers can also be called into question, especially given the positioning of them. It's going to be difficult to make really effective shots here, but this next wave I think is where Isildur and his men are really going to start to struggle, with Mountain Uruk Coast here, Tintin's army arriving from the side, but with Mountain Uruk Coast, Black Uruks, and we also saw some Mountain Orc Berserkers which were hidden in the trees previously to add more armour piercing as well. This is an awful lot of punishment that's going to be coming their way, and you can see that saturating arrow fire is also playing its part. None of these arrows are particularly high quality, but they're in enough volume here, and Arthedain really cannot afford, Isildur's army I should say, and maybe I shouldn't refer to them as Arthedain, but they really cannot afford to take these kinds of losses. Their exertions in the Black Lands have maybe taken their toll as well on their numbers. Dismounted Fornos Knights, and they're doing well on the front line initially, but like I said, it's going to be as the battle rumbles on, and you can see that some of Tintin's army are going to be making their way around, and the envelopment will start to begin, and Dunedain Trollslayers and Wardens of the North may have their days numbered in terms of how long they can continue firing for. Fornos Rhine defenders, their slightly stronger stats may very well prove to be fairly vital in holding back the initial goblin waves, keeping an eye on the minimap as well to see when the reinforcements move in, but the battle is still very young here, especially when you consider the use of half speed, many of the goblins wielding their torches. Could make for a fairly nasty makeshift weapon. Psychological effects as well on the few men that remain in Isildur's retinue, having already seen plenty of battle. And the Fornos defenders getting hit here. The Royal Court of House Armlaith can certainly make their presence felt. I mean, there's some Mountain Uruk Coast here which make for a very tempting target if the lances will come down. And now the rear line, where the Numinous Gate Guards are guarding this angle of approach as well, but they right from the off are going to have to deal with the slightly scarier Mountain Uruk Coast in comparison to the Goblin infantry that hit them from the uphill direction. Royal Court of House Armlaith, what did this charge accomplish? A fair amount here. You can see that the entire front 2, and in some cases 3, 1 cavalry unit managed to punch very deep into this host's number. More of that is going to be required, and indeed a good opportunity here for some hammer and anvil strikes. This is the sort of thing, I mean, the Royal Court of House Armlaith, in terms of the amount of damage they can do quickly, are the most potent tool that Isildur's forces have at their disposal. Mountain Orc Berserkers coming in will make that a little bit more tricky. Heavy Axemen do better against cavalry as long as it's in sustained melee and not purely off the charge. This part of the line is where the forces of evil are starting to make a few inroads. There's not very many pikes guarding this corner at all, and the dismounted Fornos Knights are not in great numbers over here. The Fornos defenders as well starting to struggle, but there is still some hammer and anvil coming in over here as well. The Dunedain Mounts Company doing a good job here against the Mountain Uruk host. I think based upon the level of damage that the forces of evil have taken so far, we can certainly surmise they're not going to be the outright victors in this fight once the reinforcements arrive, which is intentional to be sure. The question is going to be whether Isildur can survive, and we have actually lost track of Isildur. He's in here somewhere. Wardens of the North getting involved in melee alongside their pikemen, and those long swords are going to be effective even against the heightened armour that the Mountain Uruk host have to work with. It's not going to be enough to alleviate their suffering in the long run against such a strong unit of Dunedain, and there's another unit of them over here as well blocking the attack from the side. Javelins coming in, Snaga skirmishers again, another unit which... Certainly there are better javelin units in the game, but a combination of the Snaga javelins and the goblin archers so far are proving to be something which is whittling down the numbers of these battered remnants of men. Force defenders, and you can start to see that defeat is looking more and more likely, and a more aggressive mass pushing like tactic, which you seldom see a unit like the Black Uruks engage in, because it's the sort of thing which can really expose their slightly lower defensive values. But considering They are in what is largely considered to be, I suppose, a race against time in this situation. They need to finish off these men before the arrival of the hillmen, but especially the elves. The elves with their kinds of units are the sorts of things which can butcher their way through this kind of army, especially at long range. More units, and we're starting to see more and more of these overlaps now. Mountain Uruk Host finding a gap, a completely fresh unit of Mountain Uruk Host as well. And perhaps they represent the slightly stronger denizens of Mordor, as they're supposed to be in this fight. Royal Court House Armlaith still making life more difficult for the freshly advancing Goblin infantry, but I don't know how much. There's a limit to how much the cavalry is going to be able to do here. But the Mountain Orc Berserkers, surely that armour piercing has also proven to be effective. The cohesion of this defensive position is starting to be lost a little bit now as well. You can see what used to be a very neat box is now devolving somewhat into a bit of a massacre for the forces of men. Javelins get flung in. Wardens of the North are still not the sort of unit that will go down too easily. But melee defense is key for any unit in a sustained fight, and by surrounding a unit you deprive them of such a high value in that regard. There's a lot of arrows coming in. I mean, to be fair, there's going to be quite a lot of friendly fire also inflicted by a unit as inaccurate as standard Goblin archers, but at this point the momentum is with them and they need to carry that through to its natural conclusion. But we do have movement now, as the hillmen and the elves start to make their way forwards. The bows of Emenduir will be able to cover ground pretty quickly as well, so maybe not all is lost for the forces of men. Can they hold on in... well, I don't know. Even if the bows of Emenduir arrive, horse archers are the sort of thing which do their damage over a long period of time. They need immediate relief here, Isildur and his warriors, and I'm not certain they're going to get it. Still don't know where exactly Isildur is, which is a little bit of an oversight. Royal Court House Armlaith getting a nice charge here into the freshly arrived goblins. More of them arriving though. Goblin archers maybe charging into melee, trying to finish things off. Is Isildur in the Royal Court House Armlaith? I feel like I would have seen him. No, yes he is. Are we going to count that as Isildur? It would be relatively easy to preserve the life of at this point in time if he had a horse with which to flee from the braying hordes. The ones of the North, on the other hand, are still slogging away on foot. Does go to show how strong the Wardens of the North are, though. They've definitely acquitted themselves very well in a fight that Arthedain were never really going to be in a particularly good spot in. Mountain Orc Berserkers are here. Dunland Troll Slayers, they don't have quite the same all-round defensive abilities as the Wardens of the North, but that armour piercing will be coming in very handy against the Mountain Uruks that are pressuring them, but they've certainly seen an awful lot of battle. Lots of lowly goblins now swarming over trying to finish the enemy off. The bows of Emenduir are arriving. Still have a fair distance. I mean, considering this is a shorter battle in general, there's still more than half of it to go, and Arthedain very much on their last legs. Isildur getting peppered by javelin fire, the Snaga skirmishers doing their best to finish them off. Maybe we should count that as Isildur's youngest son, the rider, instead, and we can assume that Isildur himself may have died in the fighting. On foot, the ring currently lying in the mud on the ground, overlooked by all of these lowly goblins perhaps. Bows of Emenduir in a nice position. This is not the sort of situation they find themselves in all that often. Mirkwood skirmishers very often find themselves on the receiving end of a fairly harsh archer response, but they can pick and choose their targets here. Wardens of the North are here. Going to set up a new front line now, the Orcs, as they have to meet the measure of the freshly advanced reinforcements who have come to bail Isildur out. But Blades of Emenduir, basic though they may be by Mirkwood standards, given the battered nature of the Orcish and Goblin forces, they should be just fine here. A little bit further back we have the Black Uruks moving in as well. The arrow fire that is now being sent downrange from the forces of light are going to be significantly scary. All of the axe-wielding woodsmen coming in will deal a little bit more damage. They need to probably get into melee before they take too much damage at the hands of all of those units there. Blackwolds facing off against a fresher unit of Black Uruks of the mountains and actually suffering a little bit at their hands, and this shouldn't be too surprising. Black Uruks, after all, do have that melee defense and the base damage to cut through the Blackwolds pretty quickly once the hit points are gone, although yeah, they're doing a pretty good job here, and it does go to show the potential downsides of Berserker class units like this. Goblin King's Bodyguard making their way forward. Blackwolds wouldn't be their first choice of target, I don't think, for the opposite reason. Armor piercing is going to be very good at cutting through them pretty quickly. Dunlanding veterans on the way forward, that extra mass from the human units here going to assist the elves as they continue to slice their way through the Orcish forces. Dunlanding clansmen there as well. Oof. A rout here as the Greenwood Watchers find themselves with a good position to use their throwing projectiles into many of these units. The Royal Court of House Armlaith getting a nice charge here as well, so all of a sudden you're seeing the morale issues that the Misty Mountains as a faction very often encounter. Heavy Goblin Spears routing off. Woodland Round Patrol firing in from the side as well. This is the sort of damage values, and with Bows of Amenduir as well, all of a sudden the tables have turned, where once the Orcs and Goblins were washing over their foe from multiple angles, it is now the other way round, and given the level of quality that Mirkwood can bring to the table in this kind of engagement, it's going to be a very uncomfortable affair for the surviving forces of evil. More arrows coming in, Snaga skirmishers joining the Goblin King's Bodyguard on the front line, who are doing a decent job. The arrival of Dunlanding clansmen, I'm sure, won't change that too much. A fair amount of units as well fighting in the trees, perhaps a sort of secondary ambush in many ways, as the Black Uruks of the mountains wrapping around the woodsmen. And indeed they would actually be doing quite well in melee, in fact dominant in melee, but those Dunman hunters up on the hill providing a little bit of support will do extra damage to the Orcish swordsmen as they attempt to make their way through the enemy lines. It's always a desperate situation when you see Goblin Archers as a primary combatant on the front line. A fight that even the Dunlanding clansmen would be fairly confident in winning without too much fuss. Really paying fair distance from the engagement in all fairness. Amazingly enough, the Woodsman General falls before the Arthedainian one does. Horns of the North still very depleted indeed. Elves of the Elven King moving forward. Some surviving Mountain Orc Berserkers are going to be moving in to try and surround the surround. Long charge distance they have, which is a stat that can be changed by the developers. Greenwood Watchers struggling a little bit, maybe a little bit isolated against some more pockets of Misty Mountain resistance. I don't know whether the battlefield is getting darker, but it kind of feels like it, doesn't it? Goblin King's Bodyguard still in decent health, in all honesty. They've lost a few, but I would have expected them to lose a few more against the armour piercing that the Blackwolds bring to bear. Oof, that is a hailstorm of arrows there coming in from the Dunman Hunters from the rear and the Hiri Peng from the front, and Black Uruks the Mountains are not going to enjoy this kind of treatment at all. And to be fair, once again, much like in the recent mountain defence the Misty Mountains were successful in, the Black Uruks have proven themselves to actually be a strong unit. They don't often get the chance to prove how decent they actually are, I think, because in many cases the Misty Mountains are a faction which accepts the attrition that is going to come their way, and the Black Uruks are merely another brick in the wall in that regard. But they have actually had a chance in the past couple of battles to showcase a bit more of their qualities. And even against some pretty strong units in Arthedain, and then once more against... That, I believe, was actually Isildur. Yep, only one Royal Court of House Armlaith left, so Isildur has fallen. And things were going so well for him as well, but it does look as though this battle is going to follow exactly, pretty much, how it went historically, although I think one thing that you would maybe say is that the Orc and Goblin ambush party have maybe made the Elves and Woodsmen pay a little bit more dearly than they actually did on the Gladden fields. I think once Thranduil arrived it was a fairly comprehensive rout for the Orcs on that occasion, but here they've actually acquitted themselves pretty well in the face of a foe that, after the damage they took at the hands of Isildur and his boys, they were never really going to make too many inroads in that regard, now were they? Black Uruks washing forwards Dunman Hunters in much the same way as the Goblin Archers that we've already seen. It's always a bit of a desperate affair, or it's seen as such when units like them get committed, and they are here really just to tie up this Orcish battalion, which was largely successful against the Woodsman wing of the army, you'd have to say. Dunland proving themselves to maybe not have the level of quality required in a fight such as this, and the Black Uruks will find themselves very dominant against Dunman Hunters in a pure melee engagement. Further down the hill, not an awful lot left, and unsurprisingly what is left are the upper echelon of the Misty Mountains forces. Elders of the Elven King will be helping the Wooden Realm Patrol in melee, and that should finally signal the end of the Black Uruks' honestly brave effort in this fight. They still have ammunition in their archers, which shouldn't be too surprising in a fast and furious fight like this. Goblin King's bodyguard still going to be victorious over here. They've taken a few more losses since last we saw them, and it's not too surprising against Greenwood Watchers, who are up to a little bit more in melee. I mean, having a look at the battle as it stands, I mean, there's still a fair amount. I mean, the fact that the Elven Archers are as good as they are in melee means that it's really unlikely that the Misty Mountains are going to be able to turn this around, I think, although it's a lot of Black Uruks. Maybe, if they still have the numbers, they can wash downhill, and that would be most unfortunate if Thranduil himself were to also fall alongside Isildur and unnamed Woodsman General. Bringing down these Elders of the Elven King is going to surely be difficult. I mean, nothing was on their level in melee at the start of the battle. Well, the Wardens of the North are not too far behind them, I think, in a pure melee term, but certainly not now. Will they have an equal in the fight? 92 heavy Goblin Spears, Goblin Archers routing. I mean, the lower quality of these Goblin units always going to be a problem. There's still a few Wardens of the North, actually, interestingly enough, and this represents Isildur's son, I guess. He wasn't the rider. More Black Uruks arriving in decent numbers, like I said, just shy of 100. And they'll do quite nicely against Woodland Realm Patrol. It's the other Elven units that are going to be the concern. The heavier Mirkwood offerings. Are the 2 units of Goblin King's bodyguard that still stand going to be enough to see the Orcs across the line? What manner of fell creature will find the ring today? Could you call Thranduil a fell creature? Probably not. Depends what kind of mood you catch him in, I guess. Hiri Peng still trying to... Well, there goes the Arthedain forces, completely gone. Goblin King's bodyguard taking hits, Dunman Hunters running, and that's unfortunate because there's over 100 of them, and those kind of numbers, low quality in melee or not, the elves may require the assistance of such numbers from the woodsmen if they are to have a comfortable end to this fight, although I think comfort has long since departed the equation. There is Thranduil, again with his backward sword's grip. What a diva. Goblin Archers that are routing, heavy Goblin Spears. I mean, these are big losses for the Misty Mountains as well. 70 armor-piercing spears. No, Arthedain is still here. So I guess it's... it must be Dunland who are completely gone. The woodsmen being outlasted by Arthedain. Isildur's retinue standing firm. I guess one remains. Even one troll saber. Yeah, it's the Elders of the Elven King. They've taken a few losses, to be sure, but surely with taking a fair few more losses. Routing, I think, is going to prove to be a bit of an enemy. 12 Hiri Pang remain. More Goblin Archers returning, but they'll rout almost immediately as well. Hiri Pang being committed to melee. The Goblin King's bodyguard will fight their hardest, and their defensive values, I think, are what are allowing Misty Mountains to have some hope in this engagement. But as the Elven Archers, which pull out a two-handed curved blade, start to come into the equation, I'm not certain whether even they are going to be enough to withstand the coming storm. Those spears coming back, they are 70 heavy goblin spears. This is actually surprising. I wasn't expecting the margins to be this fine in this battle, but here we are. The Misty Mountains have had, even if they do go on, as I imagine they probably will, if they do go on to lose this fight, they have acquitted themselves very well indeed in the past couple of battles, which goes to, I guess, go some way to answering some people who think the Misty Mountains are a lesser faction somehow. They are not. They have their strengths, as they have proven, I think. Yes, the overall individual quality and morale is in question, but certainly not the fight they have in them when the momentum is theirs and the wind is in their sails. I thought that was Thranduil falling for a second then, but it's not. It's one of the Goblin Generals, which will surely be enough to convince many of these other units to rout. Some of the Wards of the North getting into melee as well, which even only 5 of them at this point could be extremely important. Only 6 Woodland Round Patrol. Hiri Pang are firing away. The Goblin Archers, I mean, again, Goblin Archers, they may be terrible in melee, but there are 60 of them. The kind of numbers that could really make a difference here. The Elders of the Elven King have been constantly saying that victory seems certain, but that is now flicking back the other way. And I was going to say, because they have been taking consistent losses as this battle has gone on. My. I think the mental side of this conflict is now where the Misty Mountains will maybe lose this for themselves, and you can see, yeah, the fire arrows coming in, and that is enough to rout these 40-odd Goblin Archers, and these are the margins by which this battle will now be decided, I think. Heavy Goblin Spears. Yeah, the Elves will have enough to see themselves over the line here, but I'm sure that Y2K was worried for a second there. Goblin King's bodyguard, there are still 20 of them. They're going to be finishing off these Hiri Pang. They'll succeed in that, but they will be in a worse state than the Elders of the Elven King will be, and the Elders, when all is equal, would be the victor anyway. Heavy Goblin Spears are only shaken, they're not actually, well, now they're wavering on the very edge of fleeing. This has turned into quite the affair. Hiri Pang are now being forced to shoot at the advancing Mountaineer at coast who are trying to interrupt them, and they may honestly be better off sending a few more missiles at their opponents over here. There's still 4 Wardens of the North as well, which, let's not forget, may also prove to be a significant difference maker here. Heavy Goblin Spears doing their best to cling on. Victory seems certain. I find that hard to believe. There's still some... How many Goblin King's bodyguard are there? There are 18 over there, and there are 9 there. Still very slightly outnumbering the Elders, or the Elders of the Elven King outnumber them, but again, routing like this is going to be the end of proceedings, as it were, but Thranduil is not going to have much to take home himself here, let alone Isildur's youngest son being pretty much the sole survivor. The woodsmen have either fled or died as well, so disaster at Gladden Fields is very apt on this occasion. And if not for the quality of Elven bodyguard units, this could have been a catastrophe for the forces of good in Middle-earth. The Hiri Pang actually holding on indefinitely against the Goblin King's bodyguards, to the point where they're trying a desperate charge to maybe, at the very least, assassinate Thranduil. But it is going to allow the Hiri Pang to pull out their bows and shoot point blank into the backs of the Goblin King's bodyguard. 3 Wardens of the North remain. And the other unit of Hiri Pang, I assume, was victorious. Woodland Realm Patrol, yeah, there are only two of them remaining there. And the entirety of the battle is now encompassed on camera. And not much is left at all. Around 40 elves, and that is going to be all she wrote for the forces of good. Pyrrhic victory has never been more apt, I think, for how a battle has developed. And that is it. They're just firing into the trees, launching a flaming shot or two into the stratosphere. The last remaining Orcish general, surrounded by elves as he is, surely is going to be slain here. And there we go. Thranduil manages to hold on to his life. And that's going to be a rout as well from the Mountain Uruk host. 1% the difference. I don't know whether it was intended for the battle to actually be that close. I mean, historical battles often are crafted experiences. And in many ways it was. The battle, with the exception, I suppose, of the level of losses that the elves and the woodsmen sustained here, was pretty much as it was. Isildur fell. Very, very few of the Arthedain army remain, so that can represent Isildur's youngest son leaving the battle with his life. But yeah, the Orcs actually doing surprisingly well. You can see the difference in kills is mostly as a result of what kind of army the players were given and when they were basically engaged. So obviously Arthedain getting by far the most kills because the Misty Mountains engaged them with very high numbers and mostly with lower end units. So it's not too surprising that Arthedain managed to get a lot of kills. Cavalry, high-end infantry, Wardens of the North, Dunland. To be expected, the Woodsmen struggling a lot more, as was seen in this battle, really. You can see that basic Dunlanders are going to struggle, especially against the likes of Black Uruks. Even their Black Walls, which were meant to be the glue to hold their army together, I think, struggled in the face of those Orcish heavy swordsmen. And Mirkwood doing slightly better, and they were really the clean-up crew, but they were only just able to clean things up here. As both of the Orcish armies did very well, and things were pretty touch and go there. But yeah, we'll have a look and see what did the damage here for Belagost's army. Having a look, and many of his units getting over 100 kills, to be fair. The Dunman Hunters, unsurprisingly, had a decent angle. And as far as basic archers go, that's a good return. Berserkers, we only saw them very briefly, which is a bit of a shame because you don't get to see that kind of unit very often, so maybe I should have sought them out a little bit more readily. 116 isn't too bad against basic goblins, it's passable. One unit of Blackwall's doing okay, the other one, again, less so because we saw them getting a bit of a beating at the hands of the Black Uruks, but yeah. So yeah, big thank you to Lord of Belagost for sending this one in, a nice historical reenactment there. Big thanks to all the players as well for being a part of it with him. And the next battle that we see actually in Third Age Reforged is going to be another one that he sent me, which is going to be the Easterling invasion that was halted by who would eventually be known as Romendasil. So that's going to be something else that we will see in the next battle replay. I've got a couple of others from Winged Swordsman 44 as well to show after that. A couple of pretty chaotic free-for-alls for all intents and purposes, given to me by the Womb Raider. I've got one replay upcoming as well in Silmarillion, so plenty of replays to be getting on with in the short term. And by the time this one comes out, we should be into November. I'm recording it towards the start of October, but I do have a month in reserve once again, which is good just in case of whatever may happen. And I may need to dip into that a little bit towards the end of the year for reasons that will become apparent when I do get around to doing my channel update, which will be probably towards the back end of November, maybe right at the start of December. It will happen at some point, before the end of the year at the very least, because things will be changing up a little bit in one way or another, and it will almost certainly be a good thing for the channel. There are a few things that will be changing, but it should be fine. And yeah, hopefully we can move on in 2023 with a slightly more enjoyable year than 2022 has ultimately been. And yeah, hopefully by then as well we'll also have the new patch for Reforged and things will be moving forward and we can breathe anew once again. So yeah, Anyway, I won't ramble for too long at the end of this one, because this is a little bit more of a short and sweet one. I'm actually able to record this one at the end of a work day, because it's not too crushing to have to do a 16k one, especially a historical one like this, which is a little bit different from the standard large-scale sieges that we've been doing recently. But yes, another one from Belagos to come up on the very next battle replay. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.